Welcome back. I'm Peter St. Onge. This is a weekly roundup of my daily videos on the economy and freedom, where I cut through the BS and lay out what the gaslighting clowns pulled out of their hats this week and what is coming next. Happy January 6th, America. With hundreds of J6ers in prison to this day, it is a perfect day to explore some of the darker episodes of authoritarianism in American history. So arresting protesters and dissenters has unfortunately cropped up several times in American history, starting with our second president, John Adams, so immediately after Washington. Adams was the leader of the Authoritarian Federalist Party, which wanted more power for the government and less for the people. Adams passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, allegedly on fears of foreign influence. Back then it was the French. Hunter Biden did not have a Russian laptop yet. The act made it illegal to publish, quote, false, scandalous, and malicious writing against the government, so the 1700s version of misinformation. Once enacted, of course, the law was used against critics of the Adams regime, including critics of the war against France. So the more things change, the more they stay the same. Victims included several prominent journalists, a congressman from Vermont who criticized Adams in a letter to the editor, even a tavern keeper who said, quote, damn John Adams in a moment of drunkenness. The act was finally repealed by Thomas Jefferson, who also pardoned everybody convicted. Now, the next major episode of prosecuting dissent came, of course, with Abraham Lincoln. Millions of Northerners opposed the war. They figured just let the South go, the way we might just let California go. Lincoln was having none of it, and he suspended habeas corpus, giving him the power to arrest anybody for any reason. He used this and the related Military Commissions Act against tens of thousands of critics of the war, including the leader of the anti-war faction of his own party, as well as the Chicago Times, which was one of the biggest newspapers in the country. Incidentally, Lincoln also opened fire on Americans protesting the draft in New York and Baltimore, killing over 100. This all ended, of course, with John Wilkes Booth. Alas, it bounced back with Woodrow Wilson, who followed Lincoln's script using World War I to prosecute critics. Using the Espionage Act of 1917, which is still in effect, and the Sedition Act of 1918, Wilson prosecuted roughly 2,000 critics, including prominent politician Eugene Debs and anti-war activist Kate O'Hare, who got 5 years for saying it's not our war, which it was not. FDR, of course, did it again, conducting sedition trials throughout his war against journalists and poets, as well as using the IRS to go after political opponents, including newspapers. Throughout the 50s and 60s, presidents continued using the IRS as a private army to punish critics. This was an open secret until Nixon, when the media suddenly pretended to be shocked there is gambling going on in this establishment. Now, even Obama's IRS targeted organizations with Tea Party or Patriot in their name. We can only imagine what Joe Biden's handlers have been up to. So what's next? The prosecution of thousands of J6ers will go down as one of the darker moments in American political history. Indeed, after they tried to convict the leading presidential candidate, it may go down as the darkest. Thankfully, there's light at the end of the tunnel, but the only way to stop it for good is repeal the laws and mechanisms that enable it. That includes surveillance of so-called misinformation like CISA or GEC, down to the IRS itself. These all, as long as they exist, stand as an open invitation to authoritarianism. A wall of nearly $8 trillion in federal debt is set to hit in the next year. Will Washington start auctioning off office furniture and spare aircraft carriers? In recent videos, I've talked about the mess of an economy they're handing Trump with rising inflation, a GDP built on government handouts and migrant welfare, and million-job revisions from government statisticians who are suddenly deciding to come clean with new management on the way. But there's another lit fuse they're handing Trump, which is $36 trillion of federal debt, nearly a quarter of which needs to be refinanced in the next 12 months. Toss in at least $2 trillion in fresh deficits already baked in by Mr. Biden, and it's a cool $10 trillion the federal government will have to unload. For perspective, that's roughly half the money in every bank account in America, including yours. Moreover, the biggest traditional buyers of federal debt, China, Japan, and Saudi Arabia, have all been selling for years now, along with the mother of federal debt buyers, the Federal Reserve, which had been buying debt to print money into the economy, so-called quantitative easing, but it had to flip to selling treasuries when voters got pissed off about inflation and not being able to afford groceries. So $10 trillion for sale, and your biggest buyers are all selling. The problem beyond the obscene numbers involved is that Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has been crackhead-level irresponsible in her maturity structures, meaning she's been borrowing short-term debt, 1 year, 3 year, when she should have been doing it long-term, like 20 years. Now, she did this because pumping out short-term debt is tissue fire for stocks and bonds, which is super going into an election. So Janet tried to buy an election, and now Washington's got a mountain of maturing debt to flog with nobody to buy. Now, what that means in practice is Treasury will have to offer higher interest rates to sell federal debt. This crowds out private borrowers who cannot compete with the trillion-dollar federal checkbook, so good luck getting a loan for your machine tool factory. That means fewer factories and fewer small businesses get loans. Worse, it means soaring interest costs, which are already $1.2 trillion per year, and those roll over into future deficits and future debt. The reason is, if you replace $1 trillion in debt at 2% with new debt at 5%, which is what it costs nowadays, you're looking at an extra $30 billion a year in debt service. Multiply that times the $8 billion they're selling, and it's a cool $250 billion in additional debt service, which is roughly twice all the money the federal government collects in tariffs, customs, and excise taxes, all because Janet Yellen had an election to buy. So what's next? In the near term, incoming Treasury Secretary Bessent has promised to clean up Janet's maturity mess, which could reverse some of the stock market and bond market froth. So stocks may have a bumpy patch. But the bigger picture is that $8 trillion debt wall and the irresponsibility that built it puts the federal spending debate in perspective. Because while Congress fights DOGE to keep every stolen penny, the truth is either we fix Washington's deficits or we hit a financial crisis that fixes it for us at the cost of trillions in collateral damage. A word from our lead sponsor, Unchained.com. The holidays are coming. It's time to think about your annual IRA contributions. And the IRA is an investment vehicle that can save you a lot of taxes. And with Unchained, you can hold real Bitcoin in your IRA, get access to trading, inheritance, and loans. And it's the only company where you hold the keys and can verify that your Bitcoin is not being relent like banks do. We've seen futures-based ETFs underperform holding your own Bitcoin, so why settle for less? Book a friendly consultation at unchained.com/IRA. If you own gold, you're probably very happy with prices hitting all-time highs. But your gold can do more. It can generate passive income for you. With monetary metals, you earn up to 5% interest on your gold and silver paid in more ounces. Accredited investors can earn double-digit returns in their bond offerings. All interest is paid in ounces of gold and silver stored in your account free of charge. If your metal is gathering dust at home or costing storage fees in a vault, it is time to start putting your metal to work with Monetary Metals. Visit monetary-metals.com/Peter today to learn more. Now back to our show. Canadians will not have Justin Trudeau to kick around much longer as Canada's first drama teacher and accomplished cosplayer announced he'll be resigning as head of the ruling Liberal Party amid collapsing poll numbers and a rebellion in his own party because of those collapsing poll numbers. This means Justin is now a lame duck caretaker prime minister until the party chooses a new leader, with Parliament suspended in the meantime, meaning for the first time in 9 long years, Canadians are safe from their federal government. That new leader is likely to be his wacky finance minister, Christine Freeland, a turncoat famous for calling COVID a, quote, window of political opportunity, and dismissing Canada's depression-level incomes and home prices as a, quote, vibe session. Now, once the caretaker is in office, they'll set an election date under Canada's rules that has to come by October, but it will probably come sooner since a majority of Parliament said they will back a motion of no confidence, meaning the government collapses and they need new elections. So what did Trudeau in, of course, was his economic clown show and wholesale population replacement. I've mentioned how Trudeau put Canadians on West Virginia wages with San Francisco home prices, In major cities in Canada, the average mortgage costs up to 70% of household income. Canada's had the worst economic growth out of 50 developed economies since 2019, with wages flat since 2016. That's 8 lost years. Justin has been in power for 9 years. Now, as recently as 2011, Canadians actually earned more than Americans. After just 9 years of Trudeau, they make a third less. Meanwhile, that household debt in Canada is nearly 50% higher than in the U.S. Now, Trudeau did all this essentially by exploding government spending, effectively taking over the rest of the economy. To illustrate, the 2 years before Trudeau, federal deficits were $1.5 billion. In the last 2 years, they were close to $50 billion. Nearly 40% of Canadians now draw their paycheck from government, either as a government worker or a welfare case. And then, of course, the immigration. So the past 2 years alone, Canada admitted almost 2 million immigrants. That's equivalent to 15 million in U.S. terms. So at that rate, Native Canadians will be a minority in just 7 years. So what's next? In an article that colorfully referenced Justin Trudeau, as in poop, before it was fixed, Bloomberg noted that Justin is yet another domino to fall in a worldwide left-wing collapse. So Justin now joins Rishi Sunak in Britain, Japan's LDP, Macron in France, who held on by making a deal with communists, Schultz in Germany, who's due in February, and of course our own zombie president, you probably forgot about him, and Biden's joyful sidekick. In recent videos, I've talked about these big, beautiful dominoes falling as the globalist left-wingers fail to deliver jobs, incomes, inflation, and public safety. A recent analysis by the Financial Times found that last year, every single incumbent government in a developed country lost vote share. That's the first time that happened since 1900. FT called it a, quote, crisis of confidence in democracy. But of course, it's the opposite. The people are rising up and tossing out the bums in favor of politicians who serve the people, not the elite. It is democracy. And so here is to many more tossed bums in 2025. How will the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, manage to cut trillions? With great mountains of waste in federal spending, what might DOGE go after first? So recently I covered Argentina's glorious revolution where Javier Milei cut government spending with a chainsaw. In U.S. terms, he cut over a quarter of spending, so about $1.5 trillion in U.S. terms. He laid off tens of thousands of bureaucrats, again in U.S. terms, north of 500,000 bureaucrats. He abolished over half of government departments, afuera they went. The left warned of Armageddon, so economic depression, collapsing markets, grandmas and abuelitas eating cat food. Of course, these were lies. After a brief recession of roughly 3.5% of GDP, Argentina is now in a roaring recovery, with JP Morgan forecasting 8.5% growth next year. Moreover, considering Milei cut government spending by 5.5%, yet GDP only fell by 3.5%, it suggests the private sector immediately started growing with government cuts. It was just the government that shrank. So this is all pretty exciting for DOGE to take a chainsaw to our occupying army of bureaucrats. So where to start? The Government Accountability Office, Washington's accountants, estimates there's up to $500 billion in waste and fraud alone. Toss in another $500 billion plus in crony payouts to left-wing activists and right-wing corporations, well, mixed at this point. And then hundreds of billions in useless wars, and it is surprisingly easy to cut trillions without even touching Social Security or sacred cows like national parks. So start with the ridiculous spending. $1 million to see if quail, as in little birds, fight more when you give them cocaine. $10 million to spread LGBT ideology in very Muslim Pakistan. These together add up to tens of billions. But the big ones are, starting with the military, the $175 billion plus that we've spent sending Ukrainians to die, the billions we spend defending Japan, Korea, and Europe, the bases in nearly every country on Earth. Then, of course, cronyism. So I've mentioned the hundreds of billions we give left-wing nonprofits to organize, lobby, and riot, not least being the Department of Education, the mothership for K-12 indoctrination that fails to teach reading and math, yet somehow manages to waste 5 times per student what Japan spends. On the flip side, corporate welfare agencies like commerce, agriculture, energy, transportation, the Housing Finance Agency, the Export-Import Bank, who bails out big businesses when they lose money overseas, and then toss in the regulatory empire, the SEC, FTC, Department of Labor, EPA, whose collective purpose is hunting and destroying American businesses. And then, of course, the Fed, which does both, hunting down any company that threatens Wall Street and handing hundreds of billions to bankers. Sometimes it gets up to trillions. The inflation and recessions are bonus. So what's next? Government waste is like drinking from a fire hose. The trick is avoiding painful cuts like Social Security or national parks, which are the cuts the left wants to focus on in the media, and instead drilling out the trillions of pure waste, political corruption, and agencies that destroy much more than they spend, outfits like the EPA. There's plenty there, and we can talk about parks when we've cut a couple trillion. We have a target-rich environment, but for the left's pro-government crusaders, this is the boss battle. They will throw everything they've got, including lawfare, to stop it. A word from our sponsor. If you run a business and want to get customers excited about your loyalty and rewards program, you can now implement Bitcoin rewards with Oshi Loyalty. You get all the perks of a full-featured loyalty and reward program with real Bitcoin rewards every time your customers shop, refer, and engage. Boost customer retention, loyalty, and lifetime value. And if you're looking for Bitcoin rewards when you shop, check out the dozens of companies in the Oshi marketplace at Oshi, that's OSHI.tech/shop. Start earning Bitcoin today. Now back to our show. Young adults, Gen Z, is hitting midlife crisis in their 20s. As it turns out, participation trophies do not, in fact, pay the bills. That's according to a new study by behavioral researcher Vitality, which finds that 38% of Gen Z adults, that is, ages 18 to 27, report experiencing what they themselves describe as a, quote, midlife crisis, driven by financial instability, mental health issues, and career uncertainty. Gen Z workers were almost 2.5 times more likely to experience depression compared to older colleagues, which is pretty rough when you're in your 20s. A separate study by Art Tough Finance found that 30% of Gen Z report financial issues as their primary source of stress, beating out mental health at a robust 25% and dead-end careers at 23%. Together, these have given Gen Z, quote, a growing sense of crisis. Now, what's driving it, of course, is high inflation and slow growth of the Biden years, which means wages that have not kept up with inflation. Add in houses that are out of reach until you make six figures, so much for young families. Plus a job market that's being revised into recession territory now that the election's passed, driving those who can find a job into anything they can find, even a job they hate. And then finally, millions of legal immigrants who minimum wage every starter job this side of OnlyFans. Gen Z's response is increasingly self-destructive, soaring so-called doom spending, where they splurge on trips to the Caribbean or $300 shoes, which does dull the pain today, but pretty much ends any dream of owning a house or starting a family. NYU professor Scott Galloway recently highlighted how Gen Z is the first generation in American history to make less than their parents. As in, for 200 years, our economy was working, making every generation richer. Now it broke. This contributes to rising anxiety and depression, obesity and addiction, over-medication, even incarceration and suicide, as the future fades out of sight. The Population Reference Bureau found the suicide rate among Gen Z women and girls is almost twice what it was for Gen X. As for men, one study found 1 in 3 Gen Z men have not had sex in the past year as they withdraw into a cocoon of gaming and Reddit. Cause and effect being what it is, just 27% of 30 to 34-year-olds have kids compared to 60% in 1990. One recent study pronounced Gen X, quote, the loneliest generation, finding that 80% of Gen Z men say they are often lonely and have few or no close friends. They are shutting in. So what's next? We raised an entire generation in an education system that prioritized obedience and self-esteem over excellence, hard work, and grit. Then we dumped them into a failing economy that is deeply unforgiving of the soft. Raising the next generation will take root and branch reform of government schools, ideally simply replacing them with vouchers. As for the generation we've got, the best medicine is jobs that are plentiful and that pay enough to actually build a future. It's going to be a long road, and voters will have to demand reforms on both education and economy. Government will not fix itself. Happily, we know how to fix it. Our economy worked for 200 years, and our schools didn't used to be this bad. But like all government reform, it will be trench warfare. Thanks for tuning in. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and go to petersanons.com for daily videos and in-depth articles with charts and all the gory details. Okay, we'll be watching. See you next time.